Colonel Radford dropped the observation report on the briefing table and said, without looking up, incomplete. He said it the way a man says a word he's rehearsed. Clean, precise, nothing wasted on it. He pushed the report to the edge of the table with 2 fingers and moved to the next stack. The candidate failed to maintain position integrity during the final observation window. He paused. Some people don't understand what it costs to hold still. There were 11 other candidates in that room. Not one of them looked at Sergeant First Class Adrienne Sloane. They didn't have to. The report had her candidate number on the cover. They'd all watched her come back from the 48-hour field exercise 40 minutes before the cutoff, moving through the pine line at the eastern edge of the course boundary, with a stillness that made you turn your head for a reason you couldn't name. They'd watched the instructors take her report. And now they watched Radford's 2-finger dismissal, the way soldiers watch things that tell them how a room is organized. Sloane sat with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes forward, and she said nothing. She had known this was coming, not as paranoia, not as the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent a career waiting to be dismissed. She had known it the way her father had taught her to know things, by reading what was already there, not what she hoped to find. 3 weeks into the course, the pattern was clear enough to trust. Radford's pressure didn't ease when she performed well. It increased. The better her numbers, the more precise his criticism. Excellence in this room was the thing that most needed to be corrected. She filed the observation away, alongside everything else, and waited for the briefing to end. She had arrived at Fort Benning on a Wednesday morning with a single ruck, a worn field notebook, and a rifle that had been with her since Kandahar. Wednesdays weren't significant. Sergeant First Class Adrienne Sloane had never organized her life around significance. She organized it around readiness. The Advanced Reconnaissance and Surveillance course had a pass rate of 38%. It trained soldiers to do one thing above everything else: to watch without being seen for longer than the body wanted, and to bring back information that was worth the cost of obtaining it. It was not a marksmanship course. It was not a physical selection. It was something more difficult than either of those things. It was a patience course wearing the clothes of a military program. 40 candidates assembled on the first morning. Sloane was the only woman. She had known that before she arrived. She had known a lot of things before she arrived. Her father had been a Special Forces medic, 2 tours in Afghanistan, one in a place he never named at the dinner table, but that she understood from the quality of his silences. He had spent 30 years in uniform and retired to a small farm outside Radford, Ontario, where her mother's family had deep roots, and he had spent the last decade of his life teaching Adrienne everything the military manuals described and everything they didn't. His name was Douglas Sloane. He died of a cardiac event in the spring, sitting in the shed behind the farmhouse with a map spread across the workbench, still making notations. She had found him there. He had asked her to promise 3 things the winter before he died, and she had written them in her own hand on the inside cover of the field notebook she still carried. She didn't read them anymore. She didn't need to. And she knew them the same way she knew her own heartbeat. Staff Sergeant Zerny made his assessment on the first day in the way men like Zerny made assessments, not loudly, not with malice, but with the particular confidence of someone who believed his read was objective when it was not. He said it to a candidate named Hale, just loudly enough to carry. They'll let her wash out on her own terms. That way nobody has to do it. Sloane heard it. She always heard things. Her father had taught her that hearing was a choice. You had to decide to receive information, not filter for the parts you found comfortable. She received Zerny's assessment the same way she received wind direction, as a data point that told her something true about the environment, even when it said nothing true about her. She didn't confront him. She didn't file it away as injury. She filed it away as coordinates. Zerny was 29, a ranger from Fort Drum, technically sharp and physically excellent. His fieldcraft scores were strong, but he had a particular kind of confidence that hadn't yet been stress-tested in the right way. The confidence of someone who had always been the most capable person in a given room and had mistaken that condition for a permanent truth about rooms. She noticed this. She stored it. By the second week, she had noticed something else. A candidate named Tully was coming apart under observation. Tully was 24, barely, from a small town in eastern Pennsylvania. His individual scores in neutral conditions were solid. His endurance was strong. But the moment an instructor's eyes settled on him, something in his mechanics shifted. His breathing changed. His stillness became effortful instead of natural, and the effortfulness was visible. In reconnaissance training, visible was the one thing you could not afford to be. She found him at the edge of the training area one evening, after the day's formal program had ended, running stalking drills alone in the fading light. "Your stillness is wrong," she said. He startled. She'd moved through 40 meters of undergrowth without sound, a habit so ingrained she no longer registered doing it. "You're performing stillness instead of achieving it," she said. "When someone's watching you, you try to control your body. But real stillness isn't something you control. It's something you allow." He stared at her. "The harder you work at it, the more you move," she said. "When the instructors are present, you become aware of your own body in a way that makes you a stranger to it. You have to stop managing yourself and start trusting what's already there." "How do you?" "Because I did it for 2 years before someone pointed it out to me." She looked at the tree line. "Your stillness when no one's watching is perfect. You've had it your whole life. You just have to stop interrupting it." Tully was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" He meant it genuinely. In a course where 38% passed, helping another candidate was by some arithmetic a subtraction from your own odds. "'Cause that's not how I was raised," she said simply. She left him there to practice. In the next evaluation, his concealment score improved by 31%. Master Sergeant Hex, the lead fieldcraft instructor, noticed. He said nothing, but he looked at Tully's position for 3 full seconds longer than he'd looked at any other before moving on. In a course run by people who measured everything, 3 extra seconds was a notation. The problem with her radio equipment began during the 3rd week's extended mission exercise. She was 18 hours into a solo observation post when the transmission unit began producing inconsistent signal readings, fluctuations that didn't correspond to any atmospheric variable she could account for. She understood immediately that inconsistency wasn't the same as malfunction. Malfunction produced consistent failure. What she was experiencing had a range. It moved between 2 points and held there. That wasn't damage. That was adjustment. She completed the exercise regardless. She came back with a full observation report and a radio unit she disassembled that night in the barracks, component by component, laid out on a cloth in the order of removal. She found it at the battery coupling, a contact plate that had been repositioned and then partially returned. Not damaged, repositioned. A drop or impact would have moved it in one direction. This had been moved in the opposing direction, then walked back. The geometry of the repositioning told her something that the repositioning itself confirmed. She held the component under her headlamp for a long time. Her father had told her once, during a deer season when she was 15, and they'd found a blind someone else, had built in a position that would only ever produce a bad angle, that whoever built it had either made a mistake or had wanted the person using it to fail. The distinction mattered, he'd said, because it determined what you did next. She reseated the contact plate, she tested the output, the transmission ran clean. She put the component in her kit pocket and went to sleep. She told no one, not yet. Accusations without evidence in a command environment, already looking for reasons to doubt her, were instruments that pointed backward. The score review happened on the Friday of week 3. She had finished the long-duration observation exercise with the highest composite score in the class. She'd run the calculations herself, kept parallel records from the start, a habit from years of operating in environments where official records were not always the version that held. When the posted scores appeared, her name was 6th. The methodology note beside her entry cited equipment variance affecting observation window integrity. Zerny, whose exercise she'd monitored from an adjacent sector, who had held position for 6 fewer hours before movement was detected, was listed 2nd. She looked at the board for a long moment. Then she filed a formal discrepancy notice through the proper channels. Not because she believed it would change the score, because she understood that documentation was its own kind of instrument. A record correctly filed was a record that existed. Records had a way of mattering later in ways you couldn't predict at the moment of making them. 2 days later, Radford summoned her to his office. It was a utilitarian room. Desk, 2 chairs, a narrow window facing the training area. He was standing when she entered, looking out the window at nothing in particular. The look of a man completing a thought before he has to shift to the business in front of him. He turned around, he told her the equipment variants had been reviewed and attributed to field conditions. He told her that experienced evaluators observed qualities in fieldwork that raw data didn't capture. With respect, sir, Sloane said, I'd like to know specifically what qualities were observed and whether those observations were documented during the exercise or after the composite score was calculated. Something moved across his face, not anger. Something quieter and more complicated than anger. The look of a man who had received a question he'd prepared an answer for and found the answer didn't fit. Are you making an accusation, Sergeant? I'm asking a procedural question, sir. What was observed and when was it documented? Those seem like reasonable questions for a candidate to ask about a score that affected her standing. Silence. The room held it without apology. You're further from the end of this than you think, Radford said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It had the shape of a statement and the temperature of one. Yes, sir, she said, I'm aware. He dismissed her. She walked out into the Georgia afternoon, stood for exactly 30 seconds with her eyes closed, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. Not the score, not the technical violation, but the grinding expenditure of performing at the highest level and being simultaneously required to fight for the right to have that performance counted. 30 seconds. Then she walked back to the barracks and prepared her kit for the next evolution. There was still the matter of Ghost Watch. Ghost Watch was the terminal qualification exercise. It had existed in the course since the program's founding 28 years ago, and in 28 years, no candidate had ever completed it. The exercise required a solo candidate to establish and maintain a concealed observation post in a designated sector of the Chattahoochee Hill Country for 72 consecutive hours without being compromised by the OP4 element that swept the area on a schedule that was officially randomized. The goal was to observe, record, and report the full patrol pattern of that OP4 element. No candidate had ever held the post long enough to observe the complete pattern. The course record was 61 hours. The curriculum materials noted, without drama, that the terrain and OP4 doctrine created conditions under which full pattern observation was not achievable within the operational window. Radford had addressed it during the Week 4 briefing. He had said it plainly, and he had said it while looking directly at Sloane. The conditions are not random. They are simply more complex than can be fully anticipated. That complexity is what 28 years of candidates have discovered upon attempting this exercise. He looked at her when he said it the way he had been looking at her since the first day. The look of a man who has decided the conclusion and is arranging the evidence to support it. She thought about it for a long time that night. Then she made a decision. She went to the sector 3 nights before Ghost Watch began. Not to the observation post, to the ridge above it, a limestone shelf overlooking the valley where the OP4 patrol operated. She sat down in the dark and she watched. Her father had told her once, sitting in a late October tree stand in the Haldimand County hardwoods when she was 12 or 13, that the best way to understand a piece of ground was to observe it without agenda, not looking for anything specific, just receiving whatever was already there, because the ground had been operating long before she arrived and would keep operating after she left. And most of what it was doing was visible if you were patient enough to stop searching and start seeing. She watched for 2 hours. The first thing she noticed was the drainage. A creek ran along the valley's western edge, and its flow varied with residual afternoon warmth. She could see it in the way the vegetation along the bank moved in micropulses as the soil temperature shifted. This created a predictable air corridor running north to south at roughly the same time each cycle, a draft channel that an experienced patrol leader would recognize as a line-of-sight disadvantage and compensate for by routing away from it. The second thing she noticed was the birds. A pair of thrushes were roosting in a stand of hardwoods at the valley's eastern margin, and they were being disturbed on a pattern, not randomly. Every 12 to 14 minutes, they flushed briefly from the canopy and settled again. Something was moving through the eastern margin on a route that passed directly beneath their roost. She began counting. 12 minutes, 14, 12, 13. The average was 12.8 minutes. The variance was small enough, less than 2 minutes, to be attributable to terrain features along the route rather than randomness in the patrol's timing. The OP for patrol was not random. It had never been random. It had a pattern, and the pattern was tied to the eastern margin, precisely because the drainage corridor in the lower valley created an observation disadvantage that any experienced patrol leader would route around, which made the eastern high ground the most predictable position in the entire sector. 28 years of candidates had been told the conditions were too complex to anticipate, and they were complex, but only if you were watching the wrong things. Her heart rate climbed by about 8 beats per minute. She brought it back down deliberately. She hadn't solved anything yet. She had identified a variable. Identifying a variable and accounting for it were different operations entirely. She sat on the limestone shelf and ran the arithmetic in her head for another 90 minutes. When she finally walked back through the pine line toward the barracks, the stars above the Georgia canopy were dense and still. Master Sergeant Hext was leaning against the operations building with a coffee mug in both hands, watching the tree line. He watched her come in from the direction of the ridge without saying anything. He didn't ask where she'd been. He just watched her pass the way someone watches a thing they've been waiting to see and aren't surprised to see at last. Ghost Watch began at 0400 on a Thursday. She had selected her position 2 days earlier during the authorized terrain reconnaissance window. A natural limestone shelf with overhead cover, screened by mountain laurel on 3 sides, with a 40-degree observation arc across the eastern hardwoods. She moved into position before first light and did nothing for the first 4 hours except breathe and listen and allow the environment to absorb her presence the way the environment absorbs everything that holds still long enough. The first OP4 sweep came through her sector at 0900, a 2-man moving the western margin standard interval. They passed 12 meters from her position, without a pause in their stride, without a head turn, without any indication that the hillside contained anything other than more hillside. She stayed. She logged the time. She began building her record. By hour 18, 4 candidates had been compromised. She watched one from her observation arc, a candidate in the northern sector who held position for 16 hours before a wind shift carried something from his kit, and the op for lead stopped, turned, and walked directly to the candidate's location with the unhurried confidence of someone who already knew where they were going. She noted the wind shift, she noted the timing, she added it to her record. By hour 36, the point that had ended every previous Ghost Watch on record, she was still in position. Her field notebook had 11 pages of notation. The thrushes in the eastern hardwoods were doing what they had always done, rising and settling on their 12 to 14-minute rhythm, reliable as a timepiece, indifferent to what their behavior was revealing. At hour 44, the OP4 patrol changed its approach. Not randomly. In direct response to an afternoon thermal shift that was creating a sightline opening along the western valley floor. The patrol compressed its eastern route and added a pass through the laurel-covered slope directly above her position. She ran the calculation in approximately 4 seconds, determined her position remained viable, and held. She breathed, she waited. The patrol passed 8 meters above her without pausing. She logged the time, she noted the route variation, she added it to the pattern. At hour 63, it began to rain. Cold rain, the kind that comes off the Appalachian ridges in autumn and settles into your kit and your joints and the parts of your body that don't warm back up quickly. She had prepared for it. She managed the temperature the same way. She managed everything that came from outside, not by fighting it, but by deciding it was not the problem. Her father had told her that once in a November ice storm when she'd been 12 and wanting badly to be anywhere else. The body knows how to be cold, he'd said. It's had plenty of practice. It's the mind that turns cold into suffering. She thought about him often in those hours. She thought about the farm outside Brantford, the shed where she'd found him, the map on the workbench with his final notations still in fresh pencil. She thought about the inside cover of the field notebook in her kit, 30 centimeters from her right hand. She thought about the third line on that list. At hours 72 and 18 minutes, Master Sergeant Hext entered the sector with the course safety officer and called the exercise closed. He moved through the laurel to her position. She handed him the observation log, 11 pages of notation, her father's shorthand adapted into her own system across 15 years of fieldwork. He looked at it for a long time. He turned each page carefully. Then he said very quietly, "You mapped the full pattern." "Yes, Sergeant." He looked at the log again. He looked at the eastern hardwoods. He looked at the thrushes, still going about their 12 to 14-minute business, completely unconcerned with what they'd helped produce. 28 years, he said. No one has ever submitted a full pattern report. How did you? He stopped. He looked at the birds. He looked at her. The birds, he said. Not a question. They were reading the patrol the whole time, she said. Before I arrive, they'll keep reading it after I leave. He walked back toward the operations building, with the log under his arm, his stride the same methodical thing it always was. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted by a degree or two. Enough to notice if you were paying the right kind of attention. The news moved through the remaining class, the way significant things always move through small groups. Quickly, completely, and in a way that changed the character of everything it touched. Journey heard it from Hale. He came to Sloane in the debrief area afterward. Not quietly, not in a way designed to be unobserved, and he said in front of 4 other candidates, "I said something on the first day, on the training area. You heard it." She looked at him directly. He said, "No qualification around it. No architecture to make it easier on himself. Just the statement, offered the way someone offers something they've carried long enough to know it belongs somewhere else. I was looking at the wrong things entirely." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. He seemed briefly uncertain whether that was the complete end of it. "It is," she said. "You were wrong. You worked it out. You said so. That's exactly how it should work." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. The particular quality of a man who has been holding a position for weeks and has just quietly relinquished it. Radford called her to his office that evening. She had prepared for several versions of this conversation. What she found was a man sitting behind a desk with his hands still, and a look on his face she had not seen in 4 weeks of watching him. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently become aware of exactly how long. "Ghostwatch has been certified," he said. "Full pattern observation. First completion in the program's history." He paused. "Your radio equipment discrepancy was reviewed. The contact plate repositioning is being referred for investigation." Another pause. "The score adjustment will be processed." She said nothing. He was quiet for a long moment. The room sat with the quiet without discomfort. "My son's name is Thomas," he said. She had not been prepared for that. He attempted Ranger selection 7 years ago. He cleared the first 2 phases on conditioning alone. 3rd week, bilateral stress fractures. He was medically separated. Radford looked at the surface of his desk. He went through 8 months of rehabilitation. He never went back to selection. She waited. "After that," Radford said, "I made this course harder. Not as a decision I made consciously, as something that happened beneath the level of decisions. As though if the course were difficult enough, the right candidate would be unmistakable, and the wrong candidate would reveal themselves, before I had to be the one to say it." He paused. "Before I had to be the one to tell someone I didn't know." She understood it the moment he said it. She understood it in the way you understand something that lands precisely in a space that was already shaped to receive it. "I'm not offering that as justification," he said. "I'm offering it because you deserve to know what this was actually about. It was never about your capability." He met her eyes directly, without the evaluative quality that had lived in every previous look. It was never about that. The silence between them was the kind that meant something. "I'm sorry about Thomas," she said. She meant it without conditions. He nodded once. "Your Ghostwatch report is being submitted to the Curriculum Development Office," he said. "The full patrol pattern, they'll build it into future course materials. Future candidates will be told it's achievable." He paused. "Because it is." He looked at her quietly. "Your father was SF?" "Medic. He taught me to read the ground. He taught you to watch the birds. He taught me to watch whatever was already reading the environment before I arrived." He said, "Animals don't have the option of getting it wrong. So if you want to know what the ground is actually doing, you watch what depends on knowing." Radford was quiet for a long time. He understood something that takes most people decades to learn, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was a statement offered with the care of a man deciding what was true. He had a lot of time to learn it, she said. He made sure I had a head start. He looked at her then, directly, without any wall in it. The look of one person looking at another person, nothing more complicated than that. Sergeant Sloane, he said, what you completed in this course is the highest individual performance I have witnessed in 28 years of this program. He extended his hand. I mean that without reservation. She shook it. His grip held one beat longer than the handshake required. In that one beat was everything that didn't have a proper word. Then she walked out into the Georgia evening, into air that smelled of pine resin and wet earth, and she stood in it with her eyes closed for 10 full seconds. Just 10. Then she opened them and walked toward the barracks, because the evening had a lot of it left, and she intended to use it properly. She went back to the barracks alone, while the rest of the class finished the reception. She sat on the edge of her rack and took the field notebook from her kit and opened it to the inside cover. The handwriting was hers. The words were his. She'd copied them from the shed that night. Sitting in a rental car in the dark outside the farmhouse, with a headlamp angled across the steering wheel, the notebook open on her knees, writing carefully so that nothing was lost. 3 lines. Do the work before they believe you deserve to. Hold the position after everyone else has moved. Don't let them make you invisible. She read each one. She had read them in forward operating bases in Afghanistan, in vehicles in the dark, in barracks at 0300, when the world seemed organized entirely around her failure. She had read them when she was exhausted in ways that lived below the muscle level, in the connective tissue and deeper than that, in something that didn't have a name in any manual she'd ever read. She took her pen from the chest pocket of her uniform. She held it over the 3rd line for a long moment. Then she drew a single mark beside it, clean and complete. She sat with that for a while, sat with all of it at once, the weight of 28 years of empty, the birds in the eastern hardwoods who had never once failed to do their job, the rain at hour 63, the cold, the long arithmetic, in the dark on the limestone shelf, and the sound of Radford's voice saying it was never about your capability, in a room where the admission arrived too late and exactly when it needed to. She sat with the grief and the relief and the particular fullness of having done, at last, the thing she'd promised a man in a shed to do. Then she cried, not loudly, the way a person cries when they're alone, and they've come to the end of something that took everything they had and more than they'd known they had to give. She cried for her father, who had spread a map across a cold workbench one afternoon without knowing it would be the last map he ever touched. She cried for Thomas Radford, who had asked no one whether he belonged and had still found a way to lose the answer. She cried for every soldier who had stood at a starting line and watched the room decide what they were before they'd drawn a single breath. She cried until she was finished. Then she closed the notebook. She sat straight. She breathed once, fully, the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, the still half-second the body offers before it continues, the window her father had called the only moment of true rest. Outside the barracks, the Georgia pines stood in the dark doing what pines do, receiving the night, reading the wind, indifferent to what had happened and what was still coming, holding their position through every season that had been and every season that was still on its way. And somewhere in the observation logs that Hex submitted to the curriculum office that week, in the margins of the full patrol pattern that would be studied by every future Ghost Watch candidate from that season forward, the birds were documented too. Drawn in her father's shorthand, which thrushes at the eastern margin. 12 minutes, 14, rising and settling, telling anyone patient enough to watch exactly what the ground was doing, and had always been doing, long before any soldier arrived to listen, and long after the last one left.